A beautiful Connecticut town, a mother of 5 vanishes without a trace, and the husband who insists he knows nothing. But behind polished homes and quiet streets, something darker was unfolding. A custody battle, hidden pressure, and a trail of evidence that raised one alarming question. What really happened to Jennifer Dulos? In the town of New Canaan in Connecticut, life often appeared calm, orderly, and comfortable. It was the kind of place where people noticed tidy lawns, quiet streets, and families who seemed to have built secure, stable lives. Jennifer Dulos lived there with her 5 children, all close in age, ranging from elementary to early middle school years. Jennifer herself was in her early 50s. She had a background as a writer and was known in her community as gentle, private, and deeply dedicated to her children. She focused much of her life on raising them, shaping a home that felt safe and consistent during their early years. Her husband, Fotis Dulos, also in his early 50s, was known for his confidence and polished presence. He was a luxury home developer whose work was based primarily in Farmington, another Connecticut town. He built custom houses marketed toward affluent families, often emphasizing grand designs, large spaces, and a certain modern elegance. People described him as ambitious, persuasive, someone who knew how to present himself well. To the outside world, the family seemed well established. 5 children, a large home, comfortable resources, and educational opportunities that pointed toward a promising future. But inside the home, the dynamic had been shifting long before the public ever became aware. The marriage between Jennifer and Fotis grew strained over time. Their personalities differed in ways that slowly became harder to ignore. Jennifer was thoughtful, patient, and grounded. Fotis preferred control, planning, and being recognized as the one in command. These differences alone do not end marriages, but what surrounded them did. Financial responsibilities, expectations of loyalty, and conflicting views about what a family should look like placed pressure on them both. The turning point within the marriage came when Jennifer learned that Fotis had begun a relationship with another woman, Michelle Turconis, close to her own age, and someone who became more present in Fotis's life. The affair was not hidden. It became visible enough that the situation shifted the foundation of the household. By the time Jennifer decided to file for divorce in 2017, the separation was not just emotional. It was a break defined by concern for safety, stability, and control. The divorce was not a quiet one. Jennifer expressed in legal filings that she feared Fotis. She believed he could become unpredictable if challenged. She stated that she did not feel safe. These were strong claims, not made lightly, especially from someone as otherwise private and composed as she was. The court reviewed the statements carefully. The custody battle over the children became intense. Jennifer sought full custody, and the court granted her temporary sole custody while giving Fotis supervised visitation. This meant that Fotis could see his children, but only under conditions set by the court. For a man who valued control and image, these restrictions may have felt like a blow. His life had been shaped around confidence, structure, and the sense that he could create outcomes through planning. Losing influence over his family, his home, and his financial footing placed him in a position he had not experienced before. On the outside, he continued to appear calm, composed, still building homes, still maintaining his professional presence. But the internal conflict between the reality he lived and the reality he wanted widened. Jennifer, meanwhile, focused on raising her children. She lived in New Canaan, maintaining routines, school schedules, and everyday family life. She worked to keep distance from the conflict while still navigating it through legal channels. Friends later described her as tired but steady, protective of her children, and determined to keep their daily lives from being overwhelmed by the ongoing legal dispute. By the spring of 2019, the tension had reached a critical point. The custody case was still unresolved, and financial disagreements continued. There were concerns about property values, mortgage responsibilities, and debts connected to Fotis's business ventures. The balance between personal conflict and financial pressure had become tightly connected. On May 24, 2019, Jennifer followed her usual morning routine. She dropped her children off at school in the morning, as she always did. She returned to her home shortly after. But that day would mark the beginning of a case that none of her friends, neighbors, or family could have anticipated. Later that afternoon, Jennifer did not arrive for scheduled appointments. This was unusual. Jennifer was dependable. She communicated clearly. When she did not respond, those close to her felt concerned quickly. They called her. There was no answer. They waited, but not for long. By early evening, they contacted the authorities and reported her missing. Police went to Jennifer's home. What they found there changed the nature of the situation immediately. Inside the garage, investigators found clear signs of a violent struggle. There were bloodstains and patterns that suggested not only injury, but an attempt to clean and remove evidence. This was not a case of someone deciding to leave or disappearing voluntarily. It was something that had happened inside her home, and it had happened suddenly. At the same time, one of Jennifer's vehicles was missing, a Chevrolet Suburban. The other remained in the garage. Investigators began tracing traffic and neighborhood surveillance. They looked for vehicle movements in nearby areas. They reviewed school and home camera footage. The investigation moved quickly because they understood the urgency of missing persons cases, especially when paired with signs of violence. While police worked to understand the events of that morning, thoughts turned to Fotis. He was the person most closely connected to the ongoing conflict in Jennifer's life. He and Jennifer had been in the middle of a legal and custodial struggle. The timing, the location, the ongoing pressure made investigators look closely in his direction. They reviewed his movements, communications, and possible involvement. Meanwhile, Fotis continued to present himself calmly. He did not display panic or fear. He spoke publicly through statements that maintained innocence and expressed disbelief. His girlfriend, Michelle Triconis, remained close to him during this time. She, too, became a part of the investigation because of her connection and proximity. As the investigation progressed, surveillance footage emerged showing Fotis and Michelle driving through Hartford later that same day, stopping at multiple different trash bins and disposing of items. Many of these items were later recovered, and they were stained with blood identified as Jennifer's. The simplicity of the act contrasted sharply with the seriousness of what it suggested. It also showed planning across time, not a moment of sudden panic. Investigators realized that to understand the disappearance, they needed to understand the mind of someone who felt control slipping from their hands. Fotis had been facing financial pressure. The divorce threatened property, business interests, and stability. The custody battle threatened his place in the family structure. These pressures aligned into a motive that investigators could not ignore. But at this stage in the story, there was no conclusion yet. No body had been found. Jennifer had disappeared, and evidence suggested violence, but the full truth of what had happened was still being assembled. The situation sat in a space of uncertainty. Uncertainty for the community, for Jennifer's children, for her family, and even for those watching from a distance. What remained clear was this: the image of a stable, successful family life had begun to fracture long before the day Jennifer was last seen. The disappearance did not come from nowhere. It came from pressure that built over years, shaped by personality, control, fear, and the unwillingness to lose what one believed belonged to them. The investigation that followed would move slowly and carefully, uncovering details layer by layer, each new piece drawing a sharper picture of what had happened inside that quiet Connecticut home. When Jennifer was reported missing, the response from law enforcement was immediate and thorough. New Canaan police began canvassing the area, reviewing traffic cameras and speaking with neighbors who might have seen her vehicle or any unusual activity around her home. Missing persons cases, especially those involving mothers of young children, are treated with urgency. But when investigators saw the blood evidence inside the garage, the case shifted from a search for a missing person to a suspected violent crime. The presence of blood told a story of struggle and injury. The partial cleanup indicated an attempt to erase what had occurred. Investigators believed Jennifer had not simply vanished. Something had happened to her inside her home. The next step was tracing her vehicle. Traffic cameras captured the missing Chevrolet Suburban being driven away from Jennifer's house at a time that matched the window when she stopped answering calls. Around that same time, security footage in Hartford showed a pickup truck belonging to Fotis Dulos traveling through the city. Footage captured two figures, Fotis and his girlfriend, Michelle Triconis, stopping repeatedly to dispose of trash bags into multiple dumpsters along a several-mile route. At first glance, it looked like routine cleanup. But when detectives retrieved those bags, what they found changed the direction of the investigation completely. Inside the trash bags were items stained with blood, later confirmed to match Jennifer's DNA. There were also sponges, cleaning cloths, clothing items, and paper towels that appeared to have been used in an attempt to wipe up or cover evidence. Some of the items were partially burned or torn apart. The fact that the two were captured on camera, disposing of these bags piece by piece, suggested planning and coordination. It was not a moment of panic. It was systematic. Law enforcement did not arrest Fotis immediately. Instead, they gathered additional evidence, carefully building a case. They examined his phone records, vehicle data, and any recorded movements before and after the day Jennifer disappeared. They also interviewed neighbors in both New Canaan and Farmington. People who lived near Jennifer described her as cautious and careful. She was not the kind of person to abruptly leave her life behind, especially not her 5 children. Those who knew Fotis described him as confident, often intense, and someone who expected others to follow his lead. Meanwhile, the search for Jennifer expanded. Volunteers, police teams, dogs, and search specialists combed through wooded areas, rivers, parks, and empty properties. Hundreds of officers participated. The sense of community in New Canaan was strong. This was not just a missing woman. It was a mother whose children were still waiting for her to come home. The searches continued for weeks, then months. Nothing was found. The absence of Jennifer's body made the case more complex. Without direct physical proof of death, investigators had to rely on the accumulated weight of circumstantial evidence. As they continued their work, another name entered the case, Kent Mawney. He was an attorney and acquaintance of Fotis, connected socially and professionally. Investigators believed he might have held knowledge about the events or may have been involved in planning or supporting actions after Jennifer disappeared. His presence in the case added another layer, suggesting that if something happened to Jennifer, it may not have been carried out alone. Meanwhile, Fotis continued to insist he was innocent. He gave short statements through attorneys rather than public emotional appeals. He maintained his business life and remained with Michelle. His demeanor remained controlled, which some saw as composure and others saw as calculation. Michelle, for her part, cooperated at times with investigators, but her statements shifted. There were moments when she acknowledged involvement in disposing of items, but she suggested she did not know what she was helping to get rid of. Her explanations changed over time, which raised further questions. In the background of all of this was the ongoing legal battle over the children. With Jennifer missing, and the investigation pointing strongly toward foul play, the children's safety and custody needed immediate attention. Jennifer's mother gained temporary custody, and the children were placed under her care. Fotis was restricted from seeing them. For someone who had fought so intensely for control over the family, this was a significant blow. The financial dimension of the case also continued to unfold. The luxury homes Fotis developed did not always sell quickly. Some projects struggled. Debt accumulated. Lawsuits related to unpaid loans and construction funding surfaced. Investigators noted how these pressures coincided with the divorce and custody fight. The more the financial situation tightened, the more Fotis stood to lose if Jennifer succeeded in securing custody and control of shared property. The connection between financial loss and motive became clearer. But still, there was no single moment that answered everything. No witness, no confession, no body. This is where investigative work depends not on dramatic revelations, but on patterns. Detectives approached each piece of evidence as part of a larger structure. The blood in the garage suggested violence. The cleanup suggested intention. The disposal of evidence in Hartford suggested awareness, and effort to hide. The timing aligned with a custody hearing scheduled for the near future. The relationship between Fotis and Michelle suggested partnership rather than isolation, and the introduction of Maoni suggested planning conversations that extended beyond a single day. The pattern was forming, but the legal system does not move based on patterns alone. It requires a structured, detailed, supported presentation of facts. As the months continued, the town of New Canaan lived under the shadow of uncertainty. Jennifer's friends organized community events to keep her case visible. They spoke about her in present tense, not because they believed she would return, but because they believed she should not be forgotten. Her personality, gentle, thoughtful, fully devoted to her children, became part of the public understanding of the case. The contrast between her quiet sincerity and the turmoil surrounding her disappearance was striking. Law enforcement coordinated between local police, state agencies, and the FBI. The work expanded across locations, from Jennifer's home to Fotis's home, to storage facilities, to wooded areas that matched travel timelines. Every possible disposal site was checked. Over time, the case developed into one of the most closely watched investigations in Connecticut. By this point, investigators had enough evidence to move forward. Arrests were made for charges related to evidence tampering and obstruction. The case was no longer just about searching for Jennifer. It was about understanding the decisions that led to her disappearance. Those involved now faced legal consequences as the investigation moved toward its final stage. But even as charges accumulated, the core uncertainty remained. Jennifer's body had not been found. And without it, the case did not yet have the final clarity that families and courts seek. The story was building toward answers, but the conclusion, what happened, why it happened, and what justice could look like, was still ahead. In that space, the community waited. The investigators worked. And the narrative continued to deepen, shaped by motive, fear, control, and the lengths to which someone may go when they believe they are losing everything they have built. As the investigation moved forward, the case against Fotis Dulos continued to develop through analysis of behavior, financial records, digital evidence, and the testimonies of those who had watched the marriage unravel. By this point, the search for Jennifer had become one of the most extensive in Connecticut's recent history. Yet the absence of her body remained at the center of the emotional and legal weight of the case. Without physical remains, the prosecution had to rely on evidence that showed not just possibility, but intention. This required a steady, structured approach that demonstrated how each action and choice by Fotis led to the moment Jennifer disappeared. Investigators discovered that Fotis had carefully tracked Jennifer's routines. They believed he waited for the morning when she would return home after dropping the children off at school. The garage, where the blood evidence was found, was likely the point of confrontation. The cleanup effort, supported by the items later recovered from Hartford trash bins, suggested that the act was followed by an organized attempt to remove evidence. The vehicle that left the home around that time appeared to have transported Jennifer's body. Even though the body itself was not recovered, the blood evidence told a clear story of physical harm that could not have resulted from an accident. The involvement of Michelle Triconis and Kent Maoni became part of the broader understanding of the case. Investigators believed Michelle helped Fotis dispose of evidence, an attempt to minimize what could be traced back to them. Surveillance footage showed her alongside Fotis, participating in the disposal of items stained with Jennifer's blood. Her statements later shifted, acknowledging her presence, but claiming she did not understand what she was helping to throw away. Maoni, who had personal and professional connections to Fotis, appeared in evidence related to discussions and planning. His role pointed toward knowledge of the situation, even if it was not as directly visible. While investigators built the case, Jennifer's children remained under the care of her family. Their lives moved forward quietly, protected from public attention as much as possible. The absence of their mother remained the defining circumstance of their young lives. The custody battle that had once been the center of tension had ended in a way no one had wanted. The very conflict that had created the pressure leading to Jennifer's disappearance was now overshadowed by something far larger. In early 2020, Authorities moved forward with full charges. Fotis Dulos was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. The arrest represented the turning point from investigation to courtroom process. The charges stated clearly that investigators believed Jennifer had been killed, that Fotis was responsible, and that the disappearance had been planned rather than impulsive. The case, built carefully over months, was now ready to be presented publicly. The announcement of the charges brought a surge of reaction from the community. People who had followed the case closely felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The case had never been sensational in tone. It was heavy, quiet, and personal. It was a story of a family that had seemed established and successful, but beneath the surface were layers of control, emotional strain, and financial pressure. The disappearance was not sudden. It had roots. It had warning signs. But even knowing that did not ease the impact of what happened. While awaiting trial, Fotis maintained his innocence. Public statements framed the accusations as wrong, unsupported, and unfair. His defense suggested that Jennifer had planned her own disappearance, an argument that lacked evidence but attempted to introduce uncertainty into the narrative. Yet the weight of the physical evidence, the blood, the cleanup attempts, the surveillance footage, and the timing of everything surrounding the custody and financial disputes made the defense difficult to sustain. Before the trial could begin, the case took another unexpected turn. In January 2020, while under house arrest, Fotis Dulos attempted suicide. He later died in the hospital. His death meant he would never stand trial. The legal system would not have the opportunity to hear arguments, cross-examinations, or closing statements that might have brought formal clarity. The case did not receive the final courtroom verdict that typically defines the conclusion of a murder trial. The absence of a trial left many questions suspended in a space that felt incomplete. However, the investigation's findings remained a matter of record. Law enforcement concluded that Fotis had planned the disappearance and killing of Jennifer to prevent financial loss and loss of control during the divorce and custody dispute. The evidence supported this conclusion strongly, and the legal charges reflected it. While the case against him ended when his life ended, the understanding of what happened did not. Michelle Triconis and Kent Maroney continued through the legal system. Triconis was later charged and convicted for conspiracy to commit murder and other related crimes. Maroney entered a plea agreement that acknowledged involvement in concealing information related to the case. For Jennifer's family, the absence of her body remains a profound weight. They continue to honor her memory quietly and privately. The children, shielded from public exposure, grew up in the care of their relatives. The community that once searched through forests and rivers for any trace of Jennifer holds her story as a reminder of how deeply personal tragedies can unfold behind closed doors. The theme at the center of the story is control, how one person's need to maintain power over property, over reputation, and over relationships can lead to irreversible harm. The story also shows how pressure can build slowly, unnoticed, until the consequences become unmistakable. It is a story of a life that seemed complete from the outside, but whose foundations were strained and ultimately fractured by conflict and fear of loss. In the end, the case of Fotis and Jennifer Dulos is remembered not for its dramatic twists, but for its silence, the quiet neighborhood, the calm outward smiles, the unspoken tensions, and the absence of the one person who should have been there to speak for herself. A quiet coastal home, a successful family, a marriage that seemed steady from the outside. Then, one day, a mother vanished, a husband told a strange story, and a community was left asking who to believe. What unfolded next exposed secrets, fear, and a truth no one expected. Peter Chadwick and his wife, Chu Lim Chadwick, known to friends as QC, lived in Newport Beach, California. Newport Beach is a coastal city where many families enjoy quiet neighborhoods, access to the ocean, and a sense of comfort that suggests life is steady and predictable. Peter, in his late 40s, was a wealthy real estate investor who had benefited from his family's business background. QC, in her mid-40s, devoted most of her time to raising their 3 sons, who were all school-age children. Friends and neighbors remembered them as a family that appeared stable, private, and polite. If there were problems inside the home, few people knew about them. Peter and QC met years earlier, when both were young adults working towards settling into the next stage of life. They built a home together, raised 3 boys, and enjoyed the advantages that came with financial stability. Their house was situated in a well-kept neighborhood, with trimmed lawns and calm streets. It was the sort of place where people nodded to one another when walking dogs in the evening, and where parents gathered at their children's sports events on weekends. The Chadwick family did not stand out for any negative reason. They blended into the idea of a successful suburban household. But inside the marriage, conflict had been growing. Those who knew them said the tension was not sudden. It came from pressure around money, disagreements over the direction of their marriage, and the emotional strain of maintaining a family while personal needs went unmet. These disagreements did not take place outdoors where neighbors might notice. They took place behind closed doors, spoken quietly at first, then more sharply as time passed. A marriage that had once been defined by partnership and responsibility began to feel strained. As the tension increased, conversations about divorce came up more often. Divorce, especially in a marriage where financial assets are involved, can trigger fear and anger. Money that once supported a shared household becomes something to be divided. Custody of children becomes a central concern. Each side wonders what life will look like afterward. These pressures can weigh heavily on both partners. For Peter and QC, the talk of separation was not only emotional, but tied directly to financial disputes. The arguments grew more direct, and the atmosphere in the home shifted. On a day in October 2012, this tension reached a breaking point. The couple's 3 boys went to school as usual. The day unfolded quietly outside the home, like any other. But inside, Peter and QC argued. What began as a dispute about their future and money escalated. At some point during this argument, the situation turned violent. In the home where their family had built its life, Peter strangled his wife. The exact words spoken or the final moments between them are not fully known. What is known is that the argument ended with QC's death. What followed was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a series of deliberate steps that demonstrated planning and panic working side by side. Instead of contacting authorities, Peter attempted to hide what had happened. He removed QC's body from the house and left evidence within the home that hinted at a struggle. Blood was found. A safe was left open. Items were out of place. The scene suggested violence, but without a witness, the truth remained only in Peter's actions. Meanwhile, their 3 sons were still at school, unaware of anything unusual. That afternoon, the boys expected their parents to pick them up as they usually did. But neither Peter nor QC arrived. When the children were not collected, concern began naturally. Another parent, recognizing something was wrong, drove the younger boys home. When they arrived, the house did not feel right. The children were not able to explain exactly what they sensed, but it was enough to prompt the other adult to call the police and request a welfare check. Newport Beach police officers responded and entered the home. What they saw told them that the situation was serious. Signs of a struggle were noticeable. Blood was present where it should not have been. The home, which normally would show the signs of routine family life, instead suggested that something violent had occurred. But there was no sign of QC, and Peter was gone as well. Not long after, Peter surfaced in San Diego, a city several hours south near the border with Mexico. From there, he called 911. He did not report that he had hurt his wife. Instead, he told a story. He claimed that a handyman named Juan had killed QC and had forced Peter to drive toward the border. He said the alleged man had threatened him and left him somewhere along the way. The story sounded dramatic, chaotic, and frightening, but the details did not align with evidence. There was no record of this mysterious handyman. There were no signs of forced entry at the home. The explanation did not match the physical facts officers had observed. Police took Peter into custody and began asking questions. His appearance raised immediate suspicion. Investigators noticed scratches on his neck, dried blood on his hands, and a demeanor that did not match the story he was telling. The more he spoke, the more inconsistencies appeared. Investigators moved quickly, trying to locate QC and confirm what had happened. The priority became finding her, whether she was alive or not. A few days later, the search ended when her body was discovered in a dumpster in San Diego County. The discovery brought clarity to the direction of the investigation. The cause of her death was determined to be strangulation and blunt force trauma. This removed uncertainty. The case was no longer one of a missing person or a possible kidnapping. It became a homicide investigation, focused on the last person who was known to be with her, her husband. The shock of the case spread through Newport Beach. A couple who had seemed ordinary, balanced, and private was revealed to have been living with increasing emotional and financial conflict. A wife who had taken care of her children and her home was gone. 3 boys now faced a future without their mother. A husband who once looked like a provider and parent was now the central figure in a murder investigation. In the early stage of the case, before courtrooms and legal decisions unfolded, the community watched as the pieces of the story came together. The events inside the home, the attempt to hide what had happened, the false story shared with authorities, and the discovery of the body all outlined a sequence that pointed back to the argument and the final violent moment that ended QC's life. This was not a story of strangers or sudden outside danger. It was a story of a conflict that grew inside a marriage and reached a tragic end. The outward image of stability had covered a growing fracture. Once that fracture broke, the effects spread outward, changing everything for the children, the neighborhood, and everyone who had believed the family was simply living an ordinary life. After the discovery of QC Chadwick's body in the dumpster in San Diego County, law enforcement focused entirely on gathering evidence to build a clear timeline of what happened in the Chadwick home. The early details had already pointed to Peter, and investigators began tracing his movements, actions, and communications before and after the murder. They reviewed phone records, examined financial documents, and interviewed people close to the family. Though the outward image of the Chadwick family suggested normalcy, detectives were looking for signs that the marriage had been under strain, and they found them. Arguments about money, discussions surrounding possible separation, and the overall emotional distance in the marriage became part of the picture. Police continued questioning Peter about the alleged handyman he claimed had committed the murder. He insisted that this man named one had been hired to do work on the home, and that this man had attacked QC and forced Peter to dispose of her body. But there were no receipts, no work orders, no phone calls, no witnesses, and no trace of any handyman involved in the couple's life. The story did not rely on any details that could be checked. It relied only on Peter's words. And his words did not match the evidence in the home or the physical signs on his body. Investigators studied the condition of the house. They noted the blood patterns, the open safe, and items that appeared to have been moved with purpose. They also considered that Peter had driven a long distance, ending up in San Diego rather than reporting the situation immediately. The more they examined, the clearer the conclusion became. The murder had taken place in the Chadwick home during an argument, and the disposal of the body had been done to hide the crime. With the evidence strong, Peter Chadwick was officially charged with murdering his wife. His privileged lifestyle and financial resources shaped the next stage of the case. He was not treated differently under the law, but wealth gives access to options that not everyone has. He hired legal representation and posted bail. The bail amount was $1 million, which would be prohibitive for most people. But Peter was able to secure his release while awaiting trial. This decision would later become one of the most significant turning points in the case. After being released, Peter surrendered his passport as part of the bail conditions. He was required to remain in Orange County and appear for scheduled court hearings. For a period, it appeared he was following these guidelines. He lived quietly, did not cause public attention, and maintained communication with his legal representation. There were still many unanswered questions about the details of the murder, and the legal process was slow. Meanwhile, the Chadwick children were placed under the care of relatives. They were now without their mother, and the fate of their father remained uncertain. Friends, neighbors, and extended family were still processing the shock. From the outside, many continued to struggle to understand how a man with financial security, a stable home, and a family that appeared whole could commit such an act. The contrast between external appearance and what had taken place inside the marriage caused many to reflect quietly on how easily a family can hide turmoil from the outside world. As months passed, Peter's court dates continued to approach. However, in January 2015, something unexpected occurred. Peter did not show up for a scheduled hearing. When authorities attempted to locate him, he could not be found. His home was empty. The car he had been using was abandoned at the U.S.-Mexico border. It became clear that Peter had fled. This development changed the case entirely. What had been a pending trial became a nationwide search. Authorities discovered that before leaving, Peter had withdrawn large amounts of money from several financial accounts. Estimates suggested he accessed around $600,000, enough to support himself for an extended period if used carefully. Without his passport, travel into most countries would have been difficult. But crossing into Mexico by land did not require a passport at the time, and that gave him an opportunity to disappear. Once in Mexico, Peter began moving between towns and cities. He avoided tourist-heavy areas where his presence might have drawn attention. Instead, he stayed in modest hotels, hostels, and occasionally rented rooms in private homes. He used multiple aliases, including variations of his real name and completely different names altogether. He made an effort to blend in, choosing locations where foreign travelers were not uncommon. He avoided unusual behavior, large purchases, or anything that could draw suspicion. However, despite attempting to lead a quiet life, he never settled in one place for too long. He shifted between cities such as Puebla and areas around the central and southern regions of Mexico. He worked to avoid patterns. The lifestyle was not one of luxury. Even with money, living as a fugitive means always looking over one's shoulder. Every hotel check-in, every conversation, every glance from a stranger carries a question. Does this person recognize me? Back in the United States, the case was not forgotten. Newport Beach police and federal agencies worked together to locate Peter. They studied travel patterns, passport databases, and financial records. But for a while, the trail was unclear. Without predictable financial transactions, tracking him became difficult. He had learned to withdraw smaller amounts of money and spread funds carefully. He avoided technology where possible, staying off devices that could reveal his location. In an effort to keep the case active in public awareness, the Newport Beach Police Department decided to produce a podcast focused entirely on locating Peter. The podcast discussed the timeline, the murder, the disappearance, and asked the public for help. The goal was to make the case visible rather than letting it fade with time. It was an unusual step for a police department, but it generated renewed interest. Listeners shared information, tips were sent in, and contacts in Mexico started to come forward with sightings that matched Peter's general appearance and behavior. With each reported sighting, authorities narrowed their search. They eventually received information that a man living quietly in a gated community near Puebla matched Peter's description. He had been staying under a false identity, using borrowed identification papers and keeping to himself. The routine he had established was consistent: minimal social contact, no flashy purchases, and limited movement. But even the most cautious routine can leave small patterns. Local police, working with United States authorities, verified the identity. The match was confirmed. After several years of searching, Peter was taken into custody in Mexico. He did not resist. He was transported back to the United States under secure supervision. The return was careful and controlled, without public spectacle. The man who had once lived in a large house in Newport Beach, who had once driven his children to school and lived in stable comfort, was now wearing handcuffs, returning to face the case that had never gone away. When Peter Chadwick was returned to the United States, the case moved back into the structure of court hearings, legal motions, and preparation for trial. Years had passed since the day QC lost her life, but the facts of the case had not changed. The delay only added weight to the emotional impact on the Chadwick children, who were growing older without either parent present. They had lost their mother to violence and their father to the consequences of his actions. The courtroom proceedings would bring all of this back into public view, and the story would be revisited in a way that was more deliberate and more final than before. The prosecution had a clear narrative supported by physical evidence, documented timelines, and Peter's disappearance as a fugitive. The defense, however, had to manage the reality of the case. Years earlier, when the trial process first began, there may have been room to argue about the details of intent or the emotional circumstances surrounding the killing. But Peter's decision to flee had narrowed the options. Leaving the country suggested awareness of guilt, and the amount of money withdrawn before disappearing indicated that the escape was planned rather than spontaneous. These facts would weigh heavily if the case went to trial before a jury. Meanwhile, the emotional core of the case remained centered on QC. She had been a mother raising 3 children, managing the home, and maintaining family life. Her friends described her as patient, soft-spoken, and steady. The children's lives were organized around routines she helped maintain: school schedules, meals, homework, and shared time. Her absence was a meaningful and painful gap in the family structure. Victim impact statements reflected not only grief, but the lasting effects of that loss. The children, who were still young when she died, were forced to grow up without the presence and guidance of their mother. The family that once existed could not be rebuilt. As legal hearings continued, Peter faced the reality of what going to trial would mean. The evidence, the testimony, and the years he spent avoiding the law pointed toward a likely conviction. A full trial would require reliving every detail of the murder in a public forum, with his children potentially present or represented. The prosecution was prepared to pursue first-degree murder, which carried the possibility of a very long sentence. The defense had to assess what outcome was possible and what outcome was still within Peter's control. Eventually, Peter Chadwick chose to plead guilty. The plea was to second-degree murder. By doing so, he acknowledged responsibility for strangling his wife during the argument inside their Newport Beach home. The plea avoided a trial, but it did not erase the years of evasion, nor did it soften the awareness of how the events of that day had shattered the family. In court, the tone was quiet. There was no dramatic statement, no emotional breakdown, no long explanation. The words confirming his guilt were direct and procedural. The judge listened to statements and reviewed the plea agreement. Sentencing was determined in accordance with state guidelines. Peter Chadwick was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The structure of the sentence meant that he would not be eligible for parole until he served the required minimum portion of time, and even then, parole would not be guaranteed. Any parole decision would consider public safety, remorse, and the ongoing impact on the family. In the courtroom, the focus remained on the loss of QC. The sentencing did not undo what had happened. It did not return a mother to her children or restore the life that once existed. But it marked the legal resolution of the case. The question of who was responsible was no longer disputed. The period of uncertainty that followed the murder, the period of waiting during the years he was missing, and the long search that crossed international borders had all led to this point. The aftermath of the case continued quietly. The 3 Chadwick children were already living with relatives who had stepped in to provide a stable environment. They were older now, old enough to understand what had happened, though understanding does not mean accepting. Their lives had moved forward, but the events of their childhood had shaped them in ways that would remain. People who knew the family spoke often about QC, remembering her patience, her warmth, and her constant presence in her children's lives. They remembered school events, shared dinners, and her simple consistency. Those memories stood as the truth of who she was, separate from the violence that ended her life. The Newport Beach community also remembered the case. It served as a reminder of how quiet streets and comfortable homes do not always reflect what is happening behind closed doors. People who once believed they knew the Chadwick family realized that appearances do not always show reality. The lessons taken from the tragedy were grounded in awareness. Marriages can struggle privately, financial pressures can weigh heavily, and the line between control and loss can shift quickly. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated persistence. The search for Peter required patience, collaboration, and the willingness to adapt methods, such as producing a podcast, to engage the public in helping locate a fugitive. It showed the importance of keeping a case visible rather than allowing time to erase it from attention. That decision eventually contributed to the lead that resulted in Peter's capture. In the end, the story of Peter and QC Chadwick is not defined by wealth or lifestyle, but by the breakdown of a marriage and the choice made in a moment of conflict. The crime did not come from a stranger or from outside forces. It came from within the home. The tragedy was rooted in personal decisions, emotional strain, and the inability to resolve conflict without violence. It left 3 children without their mother and without the version of their father they once knew. The legal resolution was the final step in a long process, but the personal impact remains ongoing for those who were connected to the family. The story stands as a reminder that the most significant events in people's lives often happen out of sight, in private, where emotions and choices shape outcomes long before they are seen by the world. In a quiet Utah neighborhood, a respected and wealthy doctor and his elegant wife seemed to embody stability and trust. But behind closed doors, a secret life was forming. What happened inside the McNeil home would soon expose deception, betrayal, and a death never meant to look like murder. Pleasant Grove, Utah, was known as a quiet suburban community. Neat neighborhoods, church gatherings, and well-maintained homes shaped daily life. It was the kind of place where people felt safe. In that setting lived Dr. Martin Joseph McNeil and his wife, Michelle Marie Summers McNeil. They appeared to be a model family. Martin, in his early 50s, was a physician, a former Mormon bishop, and someone who carried himself with confidence. Michelle, also in her early 50s, had once worked as a model. She raised their children, took care of the household, and helped maintain the polished image the family showed to the world. They had 8 children, a mix of biological and adopted, and were involved in church and community life. On the surface, nothing looked out of place. But inside the home, the dynamic between Martin and Michelle was not as perfect as others believed. Michelle was dedicated to her family, gentle by nature, and had a strong desire to keep her home stable. Martin, on the other hand, tended to control his environment. His personality was intense, and he wanted life to move according to his terms. To neighbors and colleagues, he appeared accomplished, but within the marriage, he could be dismissive of Michelle's concerns. She had lived with his demands for years, choosing to support him and keep the family together. As their children grew older and began spending more time away from home, Michelle started to notice shifts in Martin's behavior. He seemed distracted, took more calls in private, and began speaking to her in a rushed and impatient tone. At first, Michelle explained it away. She thought it might be work or stress. But gradually, signs pointed to something deeper. What she did not know at the beginning was that Martin had become involved with another woman. Her name was Gypsy Willis, a woman in her 30s who worked in the medical billing field. Their relationship began quietly, and Martin hid it carefully. To him, the affair represented excitement, freedom, and a different version of life than the one he lived at home. Once the relationship between Martin and Gypsy deepened, Martin began imagining a future without Michelle. The way he approached this was calculated. He understood medicine. He understood how drugs worked. He knew how to hide intentions behind professional credibility. Instead of confronting Michelle or seeking separation, he looked for ways to remove her from his life entirely while still appearing as a respectable husband. In late 2006 and early 2007, Martin began talking to Michelle about cosmetic surgery. Michelle was not focused on her appearance in the way Martin was, and she did not initially feel the need for any procedure. But Martin kept coming back to it, suggesting that she would feel better about herself afterward. He stated it was something he wanted for her and that it would be positive, Michelle trusted him, despite her hesitation. She had been married to him for nearly 3 decades. She believed that he wanted what was best. Eventually, after repeated pressure, she agreed to undergo a facelift. Martin did not simply approve the idea of surgery. He took an active role in rearranging the details. He chose the surgeon, attended appointments, and made sure specific medications would be available during her recovery. He wanted her to receive strong prescription drugs, including painkillers and sedatives. The doctor performing the surgery later recalled that Martin pushed for certain medications that were not typically recommended in combination. The surgery took place in early April 2007. Michelle went in nervous but hopeful. The operation was completed, and she was released home to recover. For the first day or two, she was groggy, tired, and weak. That was expected after a cosmetic procedure. Martin insisted he would take charge of her medication schedule. The family trusted him because he was a physician and had experience with pharmaceuticals. He repeated that he wanted Michelle to rest and that the medications were necessary for her comfort. Their oldest daughter, Alexis, who was in medical training at the time, visited the house to assist with her mother's recovery. She noticed that Michelle seemed unusually sedated. The drugs Martin gave her made her more tired than expected. Alexis raised concerns, but Martin brushed them aside. He told her he knew what he was doing. After a few days, Alexis needed to return to her medical program. She reluctantly left, but before she did, her mother said something that stayed with her. "If anything happens to me, make sure it was not your dad." It was a quiet sentence, said softly, without emotion. Alexis did not know what to do with it at the moment, but the words lingered. Around that same time, Michelle had begun noticing more signs of Martin's connection to another woman. She had seen calls and messages that did not seem appropriate. There was tension, though Michelle was still weak and recovering. The atmosphere in the house changed. Martin appeared impatient and eager for Michelle to recover quickly. But instead of improving, Michelle remained exhausted, disoriented, and almost unaware of her surroundings. The drug combination Martin gave her was stronger than what was needed for healing. On the morning of April 11th, 2007, the house was quiet. The children were going about their day. Martin said he was checking on Michelle in the bathroom. Soon after, a call for help went out. Michelle was found unresponsive in the bathtub. The scene was described as sudden and tragic. Martin reported that he discovered her there and attempted to provide aid. Emergency services arrived, but there was nothing that could be done. Michelle was declared dead in their Pleasant Grove home. The initial explanation of her death was that her heart had given out, possibly linked to her recent surgery and overall stress on the body. The medical examiner at first concluded that the cause appeared natural. People in the community expressed sympathy. They saw it as a sad end to a long marriage. Martin spoke about his loss, and many believed him. But for those closest to Michelle, especially her daughters, the situation did not feel right. The recovery had not been typical. The medications seemed excessive. And Michelle's last words to Alexis created a sense that something had gone wrong in a way no one wanted to accept. Most of the world still saw the family the same way as before, respectable, established, and stable. But inside the McNeil home, the foundation of that image had already started to break. In the weeks after Michelle's death, the McNeil household tried to return to a routine, but the atmosphere had changed. The children were grieving, trying to understand how their mother could be gone so suddenly. They had believed she was recovering. Even though the surgery had taken a toll on her, she had been speaking, resting, and trying to regain strength. The official statement that her death was related to heart problems following cosmetic surgery did not provide the clarity they needed. Something about the explanation did not sit right with several of the children, especially the older daughters, who had been closest to Michelle during her recovery. Alexis, who had heard her mother's final warning, could not let it go. Michelle had spoken calmly when she said it, almost as if she wanted to leave something behind, something that Alexis needed to understand later. At first, Alexis did not want to assume the worst. She believed in her father. He had always been the figure of authority and stability in their home. But she also could not ignore what she had seen: the excessive medication, the intensity with which Martin controlled every step of his wife's recovery, and his behavior leading up to the surgery. She remembered how he had pushed for the facelift even when Michelle had been unsure. Not long after Michelle's death, something happened that made the daughter's suspicions grow stronger. Martin introduced a new person into their home, a woman named Gypsy Willis. He presented her as someone who would help with household work and care for the younger children. But the older daughters recognized the name. They remembered seeing calls and messages that Michelle had questioned. To them, Gypsy was not just a helper. She was the woman their father had been hiding. The timing was too soon, too convenient, and too deliberate. Michelle had only been gone for a short while, and already someone else was in her place. The daughters watched Gypsy settle in, comfortable and confident, as though she belonged there. Martin treated her like part of the household, not like an employee. The older daughters tried to speak up, but Martin dismissed their concerns. Any attempt to challenge him was met with anger or disregard. Over time, the tension grew to the point where some of the children felt they no longer had a place in the home and moved out. During this time, Alexis began looking back at the drugs her father had given her mother. She remembered the labels, the doses, and the effect. Her medical training gave her enough knowledge to understand that the mixture was dangerously strong. Michelle had been given sedatives and painkillers that, when combined, could suppress breathing and awareness. It was not a typical recovery plan. Alexis began making calls, first to doctors, then to others who could give guidance on how to request medical records. She wanted answers, not assumptions. Meanwhile, another daughter, Rachel, also questioned the circumstances. She had seen the shift in her father's attitude before Michelle's death. He had been distant, distracted, and secretive. And now, with Gypsy living in the home, everything seemed too clear and yet unbelievable at the same time. Rachel reached out to her mother's side of the family, including her aunt, Linda, who had always been close to Michelle. Linda did not accept the idea that Michelle's death had been natural. She believed something had been wrong too. Together, Alexis, Rachel, and Linda began pushing for authorities to look deeper. At first, the process moved slowly. It was difficult to question a well-respected doctor, especially one with community standing and church influence. Martin had built a reputation that made people trust him. But persistence started to create movement. The Utah medical examiner reviewed Michelle's toxicology results again. The mixture of drugs found in her system raised concern. While the first ruling suggested natural causes, the presence and levels of sedating medications created the possibility that her ability to stay awake or respond had been impaired before she entered the bath. An accidental overdose seemed possible, but the situation surrounding the overdose did not align with a typical accident. As the daughters continued searching, more details about Gypsy came forward. They learned that she had a complicated background. She had financial and legal issues that Martin had been helping her navigate. Their relationship was not recent. It had roots long before Michelle's surgery. The more they learned, the more it became clear that the relationship between Martin and Gypsy was serious, not casual. To the daughters, this strengthened the possibility that Michelle's death was not just a tragic medical complication. Around this time, Martin's behavior in the home continued to shift. He attempted to maintain control, but there were moments where his calm exterior was replaced with frustration when questioned. Gypsy remained in the home, taking on roles that Michelle had once held. The grief of the household mixed with confusion and discomfort as family relationships strained. What had once appeared to be a unified family now showed deep cracks. Meanwhile, outside the home, authorities began piecing together more information about Martin's history. There were things he had hidden even from those closest to him. He had altered records in the past, lied about elements of his background, and created versions of himself that did not match reality. The perfect image he had maintained for years was not stable. Parts of his career had been shaped around appearances more than truth. As Alexis and Rachel continued urging investigation, law enforcement and prosecutors began reviewing the case more closely. They looked at the timeline leading up to Michelle's death, the sudden and persistent pressure for cosmetic surgery, the control of medication, Michelle's weakened state, and her sudden death in the bathtub. They looked at Martin's relationship with Gypsy and how quickly she entered the home. Each point alone was concerning. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The turning point for investigators came when they reviewed the specific drugs in Michelle's system. The combination did not align with recommended post-surgery care. It suggested deliberate sedation. The possibility that Michelle had been unable to wake, unable to respond, and unable to protect herself from drowning became central to the case. The initial belief that her heart simply gave out no longer seemed sufficient. While this was unfolding, the McNeil children continued to navigate life without their mother. They were dealing with grief and the difficult reality that the person they relied on now might have been the cause of their loss. The more they learned, the more painful it became. Michelle had been kind, steady, and present. She had trusted her husband, and in her last days, she had sensed something was wrong, but had been too weak to change the course. By the time investigators had gathered enough evidence to question the circumstances of the death officially, the family dynamic had changed permanently. The once well-respected doctor at the center of the community was no longer shielded by reputation. The case had shifted from a family tragedy to a criminal investigation. As investigators continued looking into Michelle's death, the pieces that had once been scattered began forming a clear outline. The medical examiner re-evaluated her case and changed the manner of death from natural to undetermined. And later, the findings suggested that the combination of prescription drugs played a key role. The sedatives in her system would have left her weak, disoriented, and vulnerable. The possibility that she was unable to react or call for help while in the bathtub became central to the new understanding of her final moments. The changes in the official medical findings opened the door for prosecutors to build a formal case. The investigation expanded beyond the circumstances of Michelle's death and into Martin McNeil's personal history. They learned that Martin had previously falsified records, manipulated people close to him, and created false identities. He had once pretended to have serious medical conditions. He had taken steps throughout his life to protect the image he projected publicly, even when doing so required dishonesty. These discoveries added weight to the idea that Michelle's death was not an accident, but the result of planning. At the same time, Martin continued living in Pleasant Grove with Gypsy Willis. Their relationship, once hidden, was now open. Gypsy was no longer presented as a caregiver or a helper in the household. She was openly close to Martin, and they acted as though their relationship was normal. But for the McNeil children, watching this unfold was painful. What was once a stable home for them had changed beyond recognition. Some of the children no longer spoke to Martin, while others kept their distance quietly. The family that had once appeared secure had fractured, and the tension was visible. The daughters, who had questioned their father's actions, especially Alexis and Rachel, continued to speak with detectives and prosecutors. They provided information, timelines, and personal accounts of the weeks before and after the surgery. Their persistence made a significant difference. Without their effort, Michelle's death may have remained labeled as natural, but their sense of responsibility to their mother and the memory of her final warning kept them moving forward. As the case progressed, Gypsy became a part of the legal investigation as well. Authorities discovered that Martin had helped her commit identity fraud shortly after Michelle's death. He arranged for Gypsy to assume the identity of one of his adopted daughters, who was no longer living at home. This allowed Gypsy to clear debts and access benefits. It was an unusual step to take so quickly after a spouse's death. It showed urgency, coordination, and willingness to manipulate legal systems. The identity fraud case moved forward before the homicide charge did. Both Martin and Gypsy ended up facing legal consequences for that crime. By this point, the story that had once seemed like a tragic medical loss had become a case involving deception, motive, and preparation. The motive was clear. Martin wanted to remove Michelle so he could live openly with Gypsy while maintaining the lifestyle he had built. He did not want divorce. Divorce would have affected his financial stability, his standing in the church, and his reputation. To him, removing Michelle appeared to be a solution that would keep his image intact. After years of preparing the case, the prosecution charged Martin McNeil with murder and obstruction of justice. The trial began in October 2013. In court, the prosecution presented the timeline of events: Martin's insistence on the surgery, the prescription drugs he requested, Michelle's weakened state, and the circumstances of her death in the bathtub. They emphasized the quick introduction of Gypsy into the home and the identity fraud that followed. They showed how the drug combination Michelle received was not medically necessary, but instead created the perfect conditions for her to be unable to resist or respond. The defense argued that Michelle's death was tragic but natural, caused by heart disease and the strain of surgery. They claimed that Martin's involvement in her recovery was that of a concerned husband and physician. They attempted to distance the relationship with Gypsy from the events surrounding Michelle's death. But the consistency of the testimony from the McNeil children, especially Alexis, held weight. Their accounts were steady, direct, and supported by medical evidence. Throughout the trial, the children faced the pain of speaking publicly about their father in a way they never imagined. They sat in the same courtroom as him, knowing that the outcome would change the rest of their lives. Yet they continued, driven by the memory of their mother and by the belief that the truth needed to be acknowledged. After weeks of testimony and review of evidence, the jury reached its decision. In November 2013, Martin McNeil was convicted of murder and obstruction of justice. The conviction acknowledged that Michelle's death was not accidental, but the result of deliberate actions. The case that had once been seen as a private family tragedy was now recognized as a criminal act. At sentencing, the court reviewed the details of the case and the impact on the family. The children had lost their mother, and through the investigation and trial, they had also lost their father. The court sentenced Martin to prison for the murder of Michelle. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime and the betrayal at its center. For the McNeil children, the conclusion was heavy. The truth had been recognized, but it did not restore what had been lost. Their mother was gone, and the man who had once guided their lives was no longer someone they could trust. The trial and sentencing did not bring closure, but it brought acknowledgement. Michelle's death was not brushed aside. It was examined, understood, and named for what it was. In the years that followed, the story of Martin and Michelle McNeil became known beyond Pleasant Grove. It was a story about appearances, control, and the dangers of believing that reputation can conceal truth. It showed how a quiet suspicion, spoken in a few final words, can change the entire direction of a case. Michelle's voice, even in her last moments, guided her children toward justice. The case stands as a reminder that behind calm neighborhoods and respectable images, there can be hidden struggles, secrets, and harm. It also shows the strength of persistence, how those who are determined to seek answers, even when others doubt them, can uncover what most people overlook. In the end, Michelle's life and her final message did not disappear. They remained at the center of the story, shaping everything that followed.